So
You're sweet.
from there, when do you fall back in love with books and say, I don't care what the world thinks, I'm going to read out in public. If you see me, I'll have a book in my hand, and that's just going to be the way of it.
I think, really, for the rest of high school, I mean, I never stopped reading. Books were always important to me. But, as often is the way, in high school, I was super busy. I had, I've always had a job or two, usually two, even as a high school student. Again, my family, we didn't have much in the way of money, and I'm not, we had a home, and that's a lot more than a lot of people have. And so I'm certainly not going to oversell, but, we were kind of, I would say my parents were kind of working poor. And so from the time I started my first job when I was 13, my sister worked at a diner, and on the weekends, if they were short a busser and like that, she'd be like, you have to come to work with me. So she worked from 10 p.m. to 6 in the morning. So starting in junior high, sometimes, and certainly around holidays, I would go work. So when I was 15, I lied about my age and got a job at McDonald's in the mall. And then I had, when you work at the mall, all the managers of the stores in the mall, of course, come to eat and get drinks and so forth. And so I met the managers of two stores in the mall, the Kenny Shoes, which I don't think even exists anymore, and then Foot Locker, which does. And both of them offered me jobs as their cashier, and within about a month time frame. So I ended up working for both of them. So I worked during the week at Kenny Shoes, and I worked at the Foot Locker on the weekend. And then, was a high school student, and I did drill team. And so, my reading, I mean, I had those books that I loved and that I always made time for, but I don't really think that I became like a truly voracious reader of books of choice until after college. Now, I was an English major, so, you major in English and literature, you're going to read a lot. And really quickly, I felt super passionate about that. I discovered art history along the way, and so ended up studying both of those. And but I loved the literature that I was experiencing in college. And so then after I finished, I started teaching. I remember, I wanted to share those kinds of experiences, those kind of aha moments that I'd had on my own, and as well as an English student, an English major in college, and set out to, I got my first curriculum, and realized like I wanted to do something more than what was expected of me, because it was so awful, to be really frank. So I started reading YA, and this was now like 28 years ago, trying to find something, because I was teaching 8th grade that very first year, and the curriculum was pretty dreadful. And there were some things that, that I absolutely was fine with, but there was the dreaded novel unit at the end of the school year that had the kids reading for 6 weeks independently, with no engagement with each other, no discussion, just sitting at a desk reading a book based on their reading level, interest aside. The choices were all classics. So it was like, if you were a good reader, you got Watership Down, and if you were a terrible reader, you got The Pig Man, and if you were somewhere in between, you might get Call of the Wild or Shane. Which I remember looking at this curriculum and thinking, holy hell, I cannot do this to kids. I can't watch kids read to themselves for 6 weeks, and these books are dreadful. So I went to a Barnes and Noble, which back then in the early 90s, the YA section was like literally 2 shelves. There was no dedicated area like you find in bookstores today. And so I just started buying copies of books thinking I'm going to find something, and started reading young adult books myself to see if I could find something better. Because I had this crazy idea that, wow, what if we all read the same book? And wow, what if I read it aloud to my kids, and we could stop and talk about what we were reading and thinking and feeling? And it changed my life.
Because then the kids were engaged, and they would be part of the conversation. Nobody's off in the corner pretending to read, but really just staring at the wall.
Yeah, that and just seeing their enthusiasm for it, and also falling in love. Like, so I had been reading pretty much most of that first year as a teacher on the weekends and at night, YA because again, I had just come off a college degree where I was reading, adult books, so to speak, and literary fiction that had been selected by my different English professors. And I read some outstanding books. I don't want to sell those books short, but they were certainly not things that were that those kids were ready to read, and they weren't things that they would have been engaged with at all. So I was reading YA, and I'll never forget the book that once again changed my life as an educator. On a Saturday morning, I'd gone to Barnes & Noble the night before and picked up a couple of new novels to try out, so to speak, to see if maybe one of them would work as my whole class book. And I started reading this book. I'd woke up pretty early, like 6 o'clock, and I started reading, and I couldn't put it down. So, like I'm getting coffee and I'm walking and reading, and I go to the bathroom and I'm taking it with me. And it was a book by a YA legend named Chris Crutcher. I don't know if you've ever had Chris on your show or not, but Chris Crutcher, and the book was called Staying Fat for Sarah Burns. And it was funny, and it like the characters talked like the characters, not the characters, but like the people that were in my classroom, and like real people, like real kids, teenagers. And it still had some really difficult issues, but they were things, these were my students who were 8th graders about to go to high school. And these kids, I had kids who had crazy worlds. And those are the kids, again, we'll talk about Hope Wins, but those were the very kids that I was thinking of. Every year that I taught, I had a kid that became a parent at this school. I had a young man whose mother was murdered right in front of him. And I say these things not for shock value, but because they were real. I had kids that were dealing with really tough stuff. And so the idea that a book that had some profanity in it and dealt with some hard issues like that, the idea that that book would be too much for them was a ridiculous idea. So I didn't know any better. And so I fell in love with it, and I used my own money and bought a class set of paperbacks. I remember having to have a conversation with my husband to say, I'm going to need $200 when we had no money. We just graduated from college and had student loans and all that. But I was like, I can't teach Shane. I just can't do it. And so he, of course, was fine with it. So I buy the books. And then I asked for permission. I was, too naive to know that's not the way you actually are supposed to do things, that you're supposed to ask like your director or your curriculum director. So I was asked to turn over a copy of the book, and then was basically told, like, you cannot teach this book. And I was like, but I have to teach this book. And it was a whole thing. Let me tell you, there's, but so to answer I'm getting back to your question, that's really, so then I just kept reading YA, and mostly because I wanted books that I wanted to have the ability to recommend books to my kids just really naturally, and to be able to come in and talk about the books that I was reading in hopes that it would spark something in kids. And not that any, one book was going to speak to everybody, but that I could, something would sound really good, and it could be like, hey, when you finish that, can I read it? And so I started building my classroom library that way, and I just never stopped. So that's really probably once I became a teacher is when I started, when I got back, where I'm super, super hooked on reading. And there was still purpose behind it, but I 100% also loved every minute of that reading myself.